So another interesting volume is this collection called Brief Conversations by Proto-Presbyter Dmitry Konstantinov, published in 1971 in New York. It's a collection of essays on religious topics that can roughly be divided into two categories. First are theological essays, and then essays focusing on socio-political issues, especially concerning the Soviet Union. So, in my brief overview of this volume, I will only focus on the second type because it's really much more interesting and original. So, the interesting part is that despite being published in New York, the collection was written with the Soviet audience in mind. Konstantinov explained this in the foreword for the book, where he talks about how he thinks that people in Russian immigration have a duty to create such literature that can later be smuggled in the Soviet Union, and it in fact was smuggled in the Soviet Union, and then unofficially reprinted there, opening the Soviet audience to entirely new ideas, the ideas that they would not be able to find in official Soviet publications. So this book is a missionary work, a missionary text. It is created to spread the notion of Christianity, to spread the information about the Christianity, not just in the Russian diaspora, but also in the Soviet Union. What kind of questions did Konstantinov address in the book? Well, on the one hand, there are questions related to the situation with religion in the Soviet Union. For example, one essay is dedicated to the prohibition of Christmas and the efforts of the Soviet government to replace Christmas with a New Year celebration. In another publication, he discusses arguments in Soviet literature against historicity of Jesus Christ. So the latter topic, I feel like, is especially interesting, as this type of literature, the literature that included historical analysis of Christianity aiming to demonstrate its pre-Christian roots, was indeed very popular in the Soviet Union, especially since the 1960s. For Soviet authors, the literature like this was an attempt to disprove Christianity or undermine its theological claims by showing from a historical perspective its non-Christian origins. So, in other words, the idea was to demonstrate that Christianity was a human product. Before we return to Konstantinov, let me illustrate what I have just said by showing you several examples of Soviet publications about religion. This first one is from 1966, and it's a translated book of a Polish author, Zenon Kosidowski, which is called Biblical Stories, Библейские сказания. It's basically a summary of the Bible, complete with critical commentary that aimed to provide an anti-religious interpretation or historical criticism of these biblical narratives. The 1960s in the Soviet Union were the time of the apex of anti-religious campaign. But unlike earlier anti-religious campaigns of the 1920s, for example, that aimed at physical destruction of temples, etc., in the 1960s, anti-religious campaigns in the Soviet Union became more clever. They became focused not on, destroying temples or prohibiting people from participating in religious services, but instead emphasized this intellectual critique of religion in the hope that such critique would undermine religion ideologically. It wasn't just about writing new books, though. Soviet publishers were eager to find and translate older scholarship about Christianity that included critical historical analysis of Christian narratives, like this book by James George Fraser, Folklore in the Old Testament, which was published, this particular edition, in 1989, in a style very characteristic of late Soviet non-fiction popular science texts, with original black and white illustrations. And another way to talk about religion available to the Soviet audience was to talk about religion through other related subjects like art history, as we see in this book by Lev Lyubimov, which was originally written in the 1970s, but this is the second edition published in the 1980s, The Art of Ancient World. And yes, technically it is a book about art or art history, but because it's the art of ancient world, of course, a lot of this art was religious art. And in a way, books like this fit very well in the larger narrative of how religion was historically constructed, how later religions emerged based on the earlier ones, and how there is a historical connection showing that all of them, despite their supernatural claims, are ultimately human products. That being said, the existence of these books, the circulation of ideas, and I should add, by the way, that Lev Lyubimov himself was an immigrant who returned to the Soviet Union in the late 1940s and generally was connected both to Russian immigration and to the Soviet intellectual milieu. So all of these texts, they show this complex circulation of ideas during the Cold War era. Again, there were authors from Eastern Bloc, there were immigrant authors returning to the Soviet Union, there were Soviet authors leaving the Soviet Union into the immigration, there were immigrant authors like Konstantinov writing abroad but aiming at the Soviet audience, discussing Soviet publications, critiquing Soviet practices, and there was a critique of these foreign immigrant publications published abroad in Soviet press. So all of this is just to show that despite the Cold War, despite the Iron Curtain, there was a constant exchange, the constant circulation of ideas, people arguing in dialogue with each other, of course in a very critical dialogue with each other, but this exchange of ideas has never stopped throughout the Cold War era.